in today's debate. Firstly, we're going to tell you how cancel culture doesn't actually change anyone's mind. And then secondly, we'll tell you how, in many cases, it's often just unfair. Okay, first bit of setup though. What do we think cancel culture is? We think it's things like digging through people's old social media posts to find times when they've said something problematic, finding like the use of like racial slurs, for example. We think what it also involves is dogpiling those people on social media. It's often a decentralized mechanism. So it's not like a coordinated attack. It's just lots of individual people feeling empowered to attack others. It's generally targeted at public figures because that's who people care about. Those are the people with fans who have the time to go digging through their old social media posts. It's doing things like encouraging businesses to drop them as a sponsor, spamming the comments every time they post, telling them, X is canceled, don't sponsor them, that kind of thing. Okay, so looking at the first point then, why doesn't cancel culture actually change anyone's mind? The context here is that if you want to successfully cancel someone, you have to have enough people with influence over that person's life who care about, whatever problematic thing they've done in order to cancel them. So you have to have like a critical mass of people who can credibly message their sponsors and say, I will not buy your products if you continue to sponsor this person because they said something problematic. You have to have enough people to make it like profitable for that company or profitable for that sponsor to cut their ties with the person and to choose to effectively cancel them. The problem with that is only progressive people, only progressives and only a particularly narrow subset of progressives who are extremely active online and on Twitter are involved in cancel culture. The products that they buy and the celebrities that they follow, the YouTubers that they follow, generally aren't actually that racist. They tend to be like broadly progressive themselves because if you are a progressive, that kind of content appeals to you. So you're more likely to watch content from like an LGBT producer, for example, because you care about like LGBT content and LGBT rights. So this looks like, for example, like James Charles being called problematic because he said that he likes to hit on straight men, for example. That's probably bad and he shouldn't do that, but he's still like a massive voice for LGBT youth. He still empowers them by showing them like, that he's like a great like figurehead. He's living like his best life. He still donates a ton of money to like LGBT charities and does a lot for the movement in that space. If he gets cancelled, we lose that influence. We lose a public figure who can stand as a figurehead who does mostly good things, even if they are not perfect. Let's contrast this with the actually like terrible people in society, the actual really racist people who see no problem with like outright blatant racism. Their fans are also racist because a similar mechanism here applies. If you're a racist person, you probably follow like other like really racist people. If you're deeply socially conservative, you follow deeply socially conservative commentators. Those people are never going to be cancelled because their fans just don't care. They're not part of cancel culture in the first place. You're never going to be able to cancel Trump or Ben Shapiro or like a racist police chief because the people who back them, their supporters, don't care about their use of racial slurs or any of the problematic things they've said. We literally have footage of Trump like admitting to sexual assault on camera. His fans didn't care. Those people get to continue with their platform. They stick with sponsors. They establish their reach further. They get new TV shows. They get new ways to spread their influence. So at the end of this point, what we've shown you is that cancel culture is effectively a system of progressive leading people tearing down other progressives, preventing them from expanding their reach, preventing them from reaching more widespread influence. So they can expand beyond the progressive movement, start influencing the views of like regular people, regular voters, just people who might be a little bit racist. You prevent them from getting that reach while the actual racists continue on unaffected and continue growing their platform. Okay, how's it unfair then? The context here is that the things that people are cancelled over are often quite small or in their past, right? So it's not like, that it's not like they're like members of the KKK, like proudly burning crosses on their lawn. It's things like Doja Cat posting in like, vaguely racist forums like 10 or 5 to 10 years ago when she was just like a lonely teenager. Two problems emerge from this. The first is that cancel culture relies on a mob mentality. That means that problems are blown out of proportion. People get caught up in the cycle of it. They get, you feel like you are doing a just thing, like you are helping the world become a better place. And so you don't question yourself. You get stuck in this like cycle of hatred against the person. It's reinforced by the hundreds of other people who are also tweeting. You have an echo chamber that you self-select into by following the like hashtag, Doja Cat is over party hashtag. That's an echo chamber where there are no dissenting voices to tell you, actually, maybe this isn't this bad. Maybe it's not worth, like, throwing away all of Doja Cat's other work over. So there's no consent there. That means there's no level of proportionality, especially because cancel culture is often fairly like binary, right? Either you are canceled or you are not canceled. There's very rarely like an in-between where you only lose like some of your sponsors or are able to like make a comeback. It either works or it doesn't. The second issue is that people just make mistakes, right? People don't understand the like deeply complicated context around the existence of racism. If you grew up in a racist household, if there's no like black people in your community, you can't see the effects of racism with your own eyes. If your only exposure to racism is from your parents telling you, actually, it's pretty good and we should keep doing it, it's very difficult for you to learn some of the nuances around like language use, for example. It's very difficult for you to like understand exclusively on your own by just like reasoning from first principles surrounded by other racists why it's okay for like a black person to use the N-word in a rap song, but it's not okay for you to use that same word yourself. That's quite a complicated issue for someone to try and understand, especially if you're like a teenager posting on social media like many of these events are that people are canceled over. It's also particularly difficult because progressivism just rapidly develops, right? The vocabulary that we use to describe like gender and sex is radically different to what we used like 20 years ago. Terms that people might simply think are like, okay out of ignorance and like purely out of ignorance are now seen to be slurs or seen to be problematic. So it requires significant education to keep up with, it requires a lot of effort to not be problematic. People aren't always given the access to education, the access to resources to learn that on their own. But finally, people just take things out of context. They take like, they say that James Charles is a pedophile because he had like some post about like a 17-year-old looking okay or something. People read too far into things. All of that means it's unfair. Two harms emerge from this. Firstly, the canceled person is just unfairly punished. We think that the punishment they get is disproportionate to the like relatively small offense of innocently using a racial slur or like not knowing that you're doing a bad thing 10 years ago in the past. That's relatively small harm. You don't deserve to lose your whole career over it. But secondly, observers feel it's unfair. All of their fans, who are primarily dedicated to them, their most dedicated fans, feel like they're being unfairly attacked. So they like stick with them. They reject the message. They say, no, these are just haters. It's fine. They reflexively like come up with justifications after the fact to justify it. But also the movement just loses credibility as a whole because people don't think it's proportionate. People think it's like the PC police gone crazy. So they never bother to listen when their friends call them out for using slurs. At the end of this point, we've shown that progressives just tearing down other progressives unfairly. We're proud to affirm.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Now calling on Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
You can hear me okay? I have a lot to get through, so let's get into it. I'm going to look at a few things in this speech. I'm going to firstly look at who cancel culture applies to and correct some of the assumptions that the Affirmative team had. I'm then going to explain why we think cancel culture is extremely beneficial for a vast number of people. I'm then going to look at why we don't think this is actually unfair. And then I'm going to look at what actually the alternatives are without cancel culture, because I think it's quite interesting at this point that the Affirmative team haven't actually explained what they do in the absence of a cancel culture. Do they just let people have continuing views that could be racist, that could be sexist into the future? I don't think that's particularly fair. But before getting into that, I'd just like to point out that obviously cancel culture is a lot broader than what the opposition wanted to suggest. It is not just digging through social media to find a 10-year-old tweet that someone might have said. It obviously applies to things that people have said at that very current point in time, but also looks like things, actual serious things like assault, and actually making sure that people are excluded from movements as a result of those things. Often, yes, that might be a more narrow subset of this debate, but it's certainly a part of this debate and something that the opposition ought to engage with. So first thing is I want to look at who does cancel culture apply to, because they had a very narrow conception of who cancel culture might apply to. The first thing they claim is that it might apply to a very, narrow group of quite powerful people and that doesn't really apply to, your everyday people who might be, racist or sexist in, normal circles. The first thing I'd suggest is that is obviously just not true, right? Cancel culture happens on a spectrum. It does happen, and often the media does latch on to the more high profile cases, but it also happens in your local circles. Like if you are a progressive group and you have a group of people and you're campaigning together and one person starts to talk about quite racist things, often cancel culture means that you could cancel that person from within your own circle. Just because we don't hear about those things in the media, that doesn't mean they don't exist. But secondly, even if it only does apply to quite a narrow subset of powerful people, that's obviously a good thing because those people have the biggest platforms and ability to continue to espouse those views. We should obviously care about punishing them. But then they say that, look, often cancel culture doesn't apply to the worst of the worst. It's just people like James Charles who might have, had a few dalliances in, some unquestionable views, but they still on balance do some good things, right? The first is, just because you're not the worst of the worst, that doesn't mean we should regret punishing you, right? Like, call me naive, but I would rather the flag bearers of a progressive movement be people who are more virtuous and actually are consistent in the way that they apply their political views and aren't occasionally racist or sexist. Maybe that makes me naive, but I think we should strive for people that are better than James Charles, right? But secondly, obviously, when it comes to the worst of the worst, the Donald Trumps of the world, right? Obviously, cancel culture is not the most effective mechanism to go about them. Obviously, the left has alternatives at their disposal, like rallying people to vote against Donald Trump come elections time. So that's not particularly relevant. Now let's look at what we think the benefits of cancel culture are. Again, recognizing that it applies to a spectrum of things like people assaulting other people, or allegedly or not, or, people being racist and sexist, right? The first benefit we get from canceling that person is the the obvious benefit of just ensuring that people are safe, right? Because if that person is no longer in that social circle or no longer has the same access to individuals in a public sphere, it means there is just less of an opportunity for them to continue that abuse if it is something that is manifestly physical, right? But secondly, even if that sort of behavior does not arise to say something physical like an assault, it is still incredibly harmful for people who are victims of sexism or victims of racism to have to constantly see that person in a public domain or any other domain and constantly be reminded of that thing. The fact that that person said those things and they got away with it. That is a constant reminder of the fact that your oppression is not taken seriously and something that we ought to regret. And by removing that person from that public platform and that level of visibility, we say to those victims that your voice and your story matters. But thirdly, we just ensure that that person no longer has a continuous platform in order to espouse those views. Again, even if those views are not the most racist or the most sexist or the most homophobic, they still matter and they still affect people, and we should still care about those things. But beyond that just immediate circumstance, cancel culture actually has broader benefits. For one, it applies as a deterrent. It says that you actually ought to be careful about what you say on your social media. And you know what? Maybe it's not the worst thing that you do a little bit of a dig through your social media and delete some of the more racist and offensive things that you said in the past. Because if someone came to read them today, they might be immensely hurt by those things. Encouraging that sort of behavior is not the worst thing in the world. Secondly, though, it actually enables and encourages more victims to come forward, because now they feel that their voice will be taken seriously and that they will be heard and that people will actually listen to them and respond appropriately if they voice a circumstance. And their main response to all of this is just to say that it's not particularly effective because you need a critical mass of people, right? That might be true, but at best, that argument is mitigatory and doesn't overcome our analysis, because maybe you do not have a critical mass to cancel every single person. That does not mean that you should not try to cancel the people that are bad and you have the capacity to cancel. So with that in mind, with all those benefits in mind, why do we think this is actually quite a proportional way of going about things, and why we don't think this is unfair as the opposition claim? The first reason is that we think that the progressive movement actually has the means and capacity to go about this in a very considered way. often the left and the progressive movement regard things like evidence. They are in tune to things like I know it's not exactly the same thing, but for the same reasons that the left cares so much about scientific evidence regarding, say, climate change, are the same reasons that people call for evidence when it comes to these things, right? You don't just make a decision off a whim. You need evidence and you need facts before you cancel someone. But secondly, often there's a huge amount of discourse that surrounds these things, particularly when they happen in quite a public sphere. So there's this discussion about whether that person should be cancelled or not. The second reason, though, why this is likely to be quite fair is because it's often done in a way that is proportional. That is to say that the progressive movement is often compassionate and is aware of intersectionality. So what I mean by that is, it is not the case that if you weren't particularly educated and therefore you didn't know the exact language that might be used or appropriate in certain circumstances. That is an intersectional consideration that the progressive movement is actually quite aware of. And therefore, if you just happen to use the wrong language in one circumstance because you weren't raised with the education to understand that thing, it is unlikely that you will be cancelled on that fact alone. The left also cares about things like, will you still be able to feed yourself and those sorts of things. They say, no, but it's an echo chamber. That assumes that the progressive movement is homogenous. It is not. It is made up of a lot of different people with different perspectives. But even if this is a bit unfair, we do not care. Victims are more important. Lastly, just very quickly, it's worth noting that they don't really point to any meaningful alternatives, like, for example, restorative justice. But we think those sorts of things are incredibly unfair of victims and will always often privilege people with a higher status in society. Also, we have short memories. So if you indulge someone in a movement for a short period of time, often you forget the offense that they've committed in the first place. That's why cancel culture is far more effective. It's good for victims and it's fair. We're very proud to oppose.
Thanks, Leader of Opposition. Now calling on Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
The opposition team demanded an alternative to cancel culture. Well, it was there in Liam's speech when he told you that when you grow up in a small town, you maybe don't have access to the kinds of education necessary to teach you why certain things are okay in particular contexts for particular people, but not for you, right? That education, that access to ideas, that is something you gain when you use the internet, something you gain when you go to college. That is the alternative. We prefer education. We prefer talking about these issues. We prefer discourse and raising attention. We don't prefer disproportionate attacks that ruin people's lives and turn people against progressivism forever. In my speech, I'm going to look at, firstly, what cancel culture looks like, secondly, about whether it changes people's minds, thirdly, about victims, fourthly, about people being cancelled, and then fifthly, about activism as a whole. So firstly, what does cancel culture look like? The opposition team raised some objections. The first one is that, it can be about current issues and serious issues like assault. This is fair, we think that's probably reasonable, but we also think our analysis applies even more starkly in these contexts, right? If you think about musicians like Chris Brown, who have been, attacked for sexually assaulting women or harassing women, you've seen just as many of their conservative fans rally behind them and literally try and defend his behavior and say, oh, it's not that bad, domestic abuse, that's just how things are. That is a clear example where our analysis is true. Another objection raised was that, it happens on a spectrum to local circles. We don't think that that's the same thing as cancel culture, right? Because you can only be cancelled if you have progressive friends. So even if that counts as cancel culture, it's highly unlikely that they get the benefits you want to talk about. And if your friends are progressive, they could just as easily educate you and talk with you about this issue rather than, shunning you from the friend group and making you feel like an outcast. Moving on then to if it changes anybody's minds. Because what Liam told you in his speech was that only people with masses of progressive fans can be cancelled. And so therefore, you're only losing the influence and the helpful hand and guidance of people who are actually pretty decent and contribute things to the movement. What we heard was that, these people don't deserve to have their places. It's better to not have somebody problematic at the head of the LGBT plus rights movement. But the issue with this is that cancel culture often actually doesn't take into account those nuances, right? Because we heard, oh, look, you have a discussion. The issue is when you only have 140 characters to say something in a tweet, it's very difficult to have complex ideas that actually get carried across. And also, even if, the progressive movement isn't homogenous, we still think echo chambers are something that occurs because of the way Twitter and Facebook's algorithms work, right? It puts you into spheres where you see tweets from people with similar ideas to yourself. So that means that you have lots and lots of people just hearing the same things reaffirmed back to them and thinking it's okay to hate on people, and actually making this disproportionate when we don't necessarily think that making a joke about converting straight men to being gay in a non-malicious way is something particularly bad, but people get ahead of themselves and run away with it. They also said that, look, these people have the biggest platform, so if you cancel them, you get the biggest benefits of education. Firstly, we actually think you get more education when people aren't scared of having the career and their sponsorships taken away from them and can own up to their behavior earlier. Because in the world where cancel culture exists, people hide it and cling onto it because they don't want to lose their followers. And what happens is when they do get cancelled, they have an apology after the fact, but they're always cancelled and people don't listen to them and people don't take their words as seriously as before. But secondly, often people still retain their fan bases to a certain extent, right? If you think about people who've been cancelled like Logan Paul, people who actually portray genuinely malicious and problematic ideas, those are the ones who are most likely to retain their fan bases. And therefore, the harms we told you about how people feel antagonized by the PC police become way more prominent, right? Well, when you're talking about progressivism on social media, it tends to be young adults and teenagers. Not many people over the age of 30 or 35 are participating in cancel culture, right? These are people who are more likely to follow blindly what someone says and less likely to listen to random YouTube comments, especially if they're stuck within an echo chamber, right? We think even if you successfully attack people with the biggest platform, the harms of that are worse. So next, talking about the victims and their right to, feel represented. We actually think that you're not going to feel like non-represented if you don't cancel someone, because the crucial part of feeling represented as a victim is having your issue paid attention to, having genuine, meaningful change happen, right? Often that kind of discussion and those kinds of issues are best when they focus on the victims, when they focus on giving victims rights and hearing their stories. We don't think it's helpful if people feel their stories are only being used to drag down particular popular people, especially in the way that cancel culture often works, right? Because people don't tend to attack creators unprovoked. Often it ends up being that they target celebrities who have been problematic to their personal favorite celebrity. And that's what we saw in recent instances with fans of Lana Del Rey went after Doja Cat and dug up dirt on her, right? Often these cancel culture parties are incredibly targeted and incredibly specific. And we don't think that hearing your issues talked about in that kind of way has any meaningful benefits for you as a victim of sexual assault, as a victim of racism. Also, there's an issue where cancel culture often can be turned against the people who speak up, right? Because frequently, cancel culture mechanisms apply when you see people's characters get attacked. So you might have a creator who speaks up about something, but often in self-defense, fans of a different creator look into their past, find instances that might prove they have a bad character, that they're lying, right? This kind of toxicity and this kind of culture related to cancelling, it affects both parties, and we think it actually makes for a more hostile environment that prevents victims from speaking up in fear of retaliation. So next then, talking about people who are cancelled and why it's unfair. We actually think that it's disproportionate, cancelling is a disproportionate punishment for the crimes these people have committed and therefore unfair. What do we hear from the other team? Well, I already addressed why we think echo chambers and the nature of social media lead to disproportionate attacks, but they also said, look, you deserve punishment. Even if you didn't do the worst thing in the world, you still deserve to be punished for it. But the issue with that is you don't, because Liam gave you really great analysis in his speech about why you simply can't be expected to understand from first principles why certain things are wrong until someone explains it to you. And because of the nature of how progressivism revolves around education, it's very difficult to find out those things unless you have a privileged background and access to the internet and exist within certain circles, right? And the idea that people have a short memory and therefore this cancel culture will be forgotten quickly just doesn't hold up when you think about the fact that lots of the best creators suffer from losing their sponsorships, and it's really difficult to maintain commercial credibility with somebody if they view as a risk, and they worry that their brand will be attached to somebody who may be cancelled at any moment, who may be talked about in a bad way. So actually we think this can have serious harms to the career. But also on top of this, I'd like to add that often these celebrities aren't necessarily adults, right? A lot of the people who get cancelled are teenagers themselves who had the luck of getting several 100,000 followers on an app like TikTok or Vine or Instagram. But before they know it, people are maliciously bringing up things from their past. To talk about young people in such a negative way and to hate on them so publicly can have seriously detrimental effects to their mental health, right? You can actually have creators want to kill themselves, want to quit the internet forever. We think that's terrible and not something to be dismissed just because somebody said the N-word when they didn't know better because they were 12. Finally, talking about, activism itself, we think that this reduces the bar for activism and it discourages people from taking meaningful action, right? Because if cancel culture becomes about tweeting things or exposing people's past and not actually about focusing on going to Black Lives Matter rallies, we think it means that white liberals and people who don't have any personal stakes in the game are less likely to feel obligated to go ahead and put their lives in the risk to actually achieve meaningful change.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Now calling on Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Can I be heard? Can I be heard?
Yep.
Now you can. First time was a bit softy.
Oh, easy. The first observation I want to make in this speech is that at no point in second affirmative speech did they ever engage with the wealth of benefits that Jess gave you. The only thing that they told us was that the progressive movement was bloodthirsty and menacing, contrary to what we told you at first negative, and their entire case relies upon that. We gave you two responses at Jess. We told you firstly that the progressive movement was capable of enacting change upon a spectrum, which is to say that cancellation was when a critical mass accrued, but when an insufficient number of people accrued to create a cancellation, there was a discussion about what that person did. There's perhaps an apology from that person when they come forward and they acknowledge that they did something bad. And there was just that discourse that happened. They tell us, no, cancel culture is only when cancellation occurs. But the discussion itself is a result of cancel culture, and therefore the two are exactly the same. The second response that we gave you was that the left has a vested incentive in wanting to be progressive. That is to say that it understands concepts like intersectionality because we understand concepts like intersectionality. Like we are the progressive movement to some extent. And it settles for apologies in certain instances. When Dave Chappelle came forward and apologized for making transphobic jokes, people took that at face value and accepted it. When Liam Neeson apologized for making a racist tweet, people took that at face value and accepted it. This is what the progressive movement is capable of. The only response that we hear to Jeff is, but there will be echo chambers, and that will mean that the discussion doesn't allow for apologies. Sure, but the nature of the echo chamber happens such that everyone in that echo chamber has a vested incentive in being progressive. And to the extent to which you are progressive, you check whether or not you are being fair in the way that you are discussing or treating an individual. So the implication of that means that all of the benefits that we gave you at Jess, about safety for victims, about emotional support for victims, about stopping oppressors in their tracks, accrue, have received no response. And for this team to even contest this debate, they need to have a response of third affirmative. Meanwhile, a lot of their harms that only accrue in situations where cancel culture is particularly barbaric or evil don't accrue, or rather the scale to which they accrue is significantly smaller than the scale to which our benefits accrue, winning us this debate already. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through what the affirmative case is, kind of break it down, then go into a new piece of substantive I think is clever. Cool. The first claim that we hear is that CC only punishes public progressive figures, and the harm that accrues then is that we don't punish people like Donald Trump or Ben Shapiro. The first thing to note is that this is untrue. That is to say that a lot of people who aren't explicitly progressive have been punished by the progressive movement. That is to say people like Liam Neeson, Dave Chappelle, Harvey Weinstein aren't, out in the open with LGBT flags. They're not as progressive as the people that affirmative are talking about. So we are capable of enacting change on a larger degree than they say that we are. And secondly, note how incredibly uncomparative this is. Which is to say that even if we're not able to take down Donald Trump, what are they doing to take down Donald Trump? This argument is contingent on showing that we harm, it is comparatively worse to punish progressive people who do bad things than to not punish people altogether. The second claim that they then tell us, obviously, is that it is unfair to punish progressive people who messed up for two reasons. Firstly, because it's not proportional, the punishment that they receive. And secondly, that they could have made a mistake. On proportionality, we have three responses. Firstly, it is untrue that we cannot have proportional punishment, which is to say that both Jess and I have established that there is a spectrum of punishment that is available, and as such, we are capable of delivering proportional punishment, which means that it isn't unfair to punish progressive people, provided that the punishment is proportional, fulfilling that burden. But secondly, where people are cancelled, it usually happens when there is a critical mass of people who want that cancellation to happen, which means that we say that to the extent to which the entirety or a large portion of the progressive movement believes someone to have done something so heinous that decries cancelling, we would say that is probably fair in itself because that person's probably done something very bad. And the third thing to note is that I think, as Jess has pointed out, the progressive movement has had a vested incentive in being fair to the extent to which it is literally one of their core values. So we would say that they are capable and willing to administer proportional justice. That takes care of their claim about how it is unproportional in the way that we deliver punishment. The second thing that they tell us is, progressive people might have made mistakes and we should punish them for having made mistakes. Three responses to this. Firstly, there is a deterrent, even if it is true that they made a mistake and that it isn't indicative of who they are. I think that's still, like, even then there is a benefit that accrues insofar as creating a deterrent effect and a signaling effect for the rest of society, which is to say that you signal and you cement that a particular type of behavior is unacceptable and good. And we would say that is a larger benefit than an individual being punished unfairly. But secondly, when someone makes a mistake, they're able to apologize, given that there is a spectrum of punishment that is available to them. And as such, we would say that it isn't unfair to apologize for a mistake that you made, or else all apologies would be unfair. That's a ludicrous thing. The third thing to note is that even if it is accidental, it can be a bad thing in itself. Like, just because something was done unintentionally does not mean that it was bad in itself. That is not a legitimate moral claim. And that takes care of their material about how it's unfair to punish progressive people who messed up. And that's 2/3 of their case. The final component of their case is, this will hurt the progressive movement. And they give us two reasons for why this is true. Firstly, they tell us this creates a schism. And secondly, they tell us that this creates reputational damage for the progressive movement. On the idea of schism, they tell us that when there is an individual that is like hotly discussed within that group, people who support that person will side against people who don't will go against people who don't support that person, creating a rift. Firstly, we would tell you that if the action can be legitimately defended and discussed by progressive people, we would say that there's probably likely to have some sort of discourse come about rather than a cancellation, because cancellation occurs only in the worst of instances. And to the extent to which 45% of the progressive movement is saying X person did not do something wrong, we'd probably say that there is a legitimate argument to be made that leads to proper, good discussion. The second response is we would claim that schism as a benefit that leads to discourse and that leads to the progressive movement reevaluating its moral stance and what it deems appropriate and going in the future. The second thing that they tell us on this is about reputational damage. Two responses here. Firstly, no, I don't think this is true, which is to say that even the reputational damage doesn't happen within the progressive movement. It happens in people who were never going to engage with the progressive movement. Like, Fox News is always going to be shitting on the progressive movement no matter what happens. Even if there is reputational damage and Megyn Kelly is a little bit angrier one day, that isn't a harm that's be comparative. That is a comparatively very small harm that accrues to no effect. At this point in the debate, all of our benefits stand and none of their case stand. I'm going to present one additional benefit and do a quick way out. Cancel culture importantly needs to be recognized as an example of progressive ignition, which is to say that it demonstrates progressive strength in the best way possible. Three reasons for why that's true. One, there's a lot of media attention. Two, there is a demonstration of righteousness that doesn't happen in very many other vectors of media. And thirdly, it shows that a vocal minority is capable of taking down very powerful, very wealthy, and very influential people. What that does is that it ends up igniting progressive movements in other parts of the world. That looks like, for example, the example of the #MeToo movement in India, where the precedent from American change brought forward radical change within India. That looked like politicians like the Minister of External Affairs being held accountable for sexual harassment that he did. Long-term actors that have been recognized as being evil finally being brought to account, like Salman Khan, because of this movement. The precedent of progressive aggression in America is what brought this change forward. It's important that the change was aggressive for two reasons. Firstly, because people in the Indian movement, or people in subjugated areas, have a change of expectations in what they can want. That is to say that what they want initially might not have been what is actually what they want, and they go push for that. Secondly, you are able as a vocal minority to create a very very dominant view that is able to overcome a diffuse view held by the majority. We would say that without cancel culture, that wouldn't have been. Weigh this. Some people, and perhaps best case, are disproportionately punished, maybe. We give you victims that feel safer, people that come forward, and progressivism that empowers change in all parts of the world. The alternative was one where people forgot, where victims were forgotten, and people weren't brought to account. Very, very proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now calling on Government Whip. Here.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. Although it may be true that the progressive movement wants to be really proportional, they want to be really intersectional, they want to be really sensible, we tell you that the majority of people who actually get involved within cancel culture aren't, right? Because when we go on Twitter, the people that are cancelling, it's not just one homogenous group of a progressive, and usually it's like 12-year-old kids joining in because it's a trendy thing to do. They join in the Gabby Hunter's over party, and that's when it becomes really disproportionate. That's when you start doing things because you want that you want the affirmation when people retweet your cancelling tweets, and that's when it becomes really disproportionate, and that's why cancel culture can never work. 2 questions in today's debate. Firstly, does cancel culture actually effectively stamp out things such as racism and homophobia? And then secondly, a question about, is the punishment of cancel culture actually proportional to what the individual actually deserves? Okay, firstly, does cancel culture actually effectively stamp out racism and homophobia? We got 3 claims from the negating team. I'm going to show why all 3 of those aren't true. The first thing that they claim, they told us that the reason why cancel culture is is really effective is due to the fact they're able to take away the platform for these individuals to stamp. You're going to be able to take away the platform, which means you're able to stamp out their ability to give these really bad messages. Our first line of response, we just don't think it's true that necessarily cancelling someone means that they're never ever going to have a platform ever again, right? We gave you the example of Logan Paul and James Charles, where despite the fact that they were supposedly cancelled, people will still resubscribe to them like 3 weeks later and still continue listening to the really harmful things that they said. But our second line of response to this is, even if it is true that this individual, this famous person, is too scared to post things that aren't progressive anymore, we just think there's going to be so much backlash from all their supporters who feel like their beloved Chris Brown is being bullied by the whole entire population, and they just come on and defend him, right? That means you actually get more and more and more people saying all of their really harmful views that they have, which means you actually get more of these messages being spread rather than less. We tell you the reason why this is so harmful is because when we think about people like Rihanna, who got domestically abused by Chris Brown, she has to go onto social media and read all of his supporters defending his actions, saying that she deserved to be beaten because she wasn't subservient enough to Chris Brown. We tell you that's really harmful, and we tell you that also takes down all their mechanisms about why you're going to get more victims coming forward, because victims don't want to come forward when they know that the person who did whatever bad thing to them is going to get cancelled, which probably means there's going to be backlash against them. They don't want to log on to social media to see these things, which is why they're not going to speak out. They're actually going to speak out even less. Let's look at the second thing that they told us. They told us that it's going to be a deterrent effect because you know that people are likely to go onto your social media and see that you said this harmful thing from 10 years ago. But the reason why this isn't actually a difference effect is it's due to the fact that cancel culture only applies to a really, really small subset of people, right? The people who are getting cancelled are only the really famous people, due to the fact that people aren't just going to log on to random teenagers' Twitter accounts and look at all of their tweets from 2 years ago, because they just don't have enough time to do so. So for the majority of people who are thinking about whether or not they're going to tweet this racist tweet, they just assume that people won't actually care. They assume they're not going to get cancelled in 2 years' time because they're not going to become famous, which means there's not actually really that big of a deterrence effect on these individuals. The second thing that we tell you is there's also not a big deterrence effect on celebrities also, due to the fact that they've seen in the media, despite many people getting cancelled, they do lose their sponsorships for like a short time period. But usually if you're like a white male who is popular and good looking, you're going to get people resubscribe to you anyways. The only people who actually really fall from the only people who actually really fall and suffer from cancel culture is the minority groups that they don't want to talk about. Third thing that they claimed, they wanted to tell us that the last reason why it was really good is due to the fact that they wanted the flag bearers of the progressive movement to be the individuals who are the best, and we can't let anyone who's slightly flawed be those people. But we need to look at this comparatively, right? Because when we're looking at the number one biggest beauty YouTuber on YouTube, it is James Charles, and it is untrue, and it is true that he is flawed. He does have flawed views, but we tell him that the effect that he has is still really big, right? We tell you that it's really important that 14 million young children are able to log onto YouTube and realize that it's actually okay for young boys to wear makeup, we tell you that's a really, really good thing. If it is the fact that we want to completely cancel James Charles, though, we just don't think that the flagpole is going to go to the best progressive person ever, and instead it's just likely to go to the next top YouTuber, who is a really southern conservative woman, Laura Lee, who's just going to tell kids that it's not okay for little young kids to wear makeup. So what we tell you is that yes, first speaker was correct when she said it was naive for her to think that it was possible for us to get the best person to be the flag bearers. Instead, the progressive movement needs to weigh it up, right? Yes, it might be harmful that James Charles says some marginal things, but he also does really, really good things in terms of making sure that young boys feel comfortable, which is why we should still let him do all the other good things that he is doing. So let's look at what the comparative is and why we think our world is actually better. First thing, we tell you that in our world, when you're actually attacking the message that is being sent rather than the person, it's harmful because it means that there's no dogpiling of their supporters, right? Because when you look at like Chris Brown, for example, if we're telling Chris Brown that yes, we still support you as an artist and we're still willing to listen to your music, but every single other thing that you did is really, really harmful, that's the point where their supporters don't have to feel the need to like come on and like defend Chris Brown and say that it's actually okay that he's a domestic abuser. And instead, they'll just continue listening to his music, but do it on the down low. We think that's much better because it means that victims themselves, such as Rihanna, don't feel attacked when they see all his defenders. But the second thing that we tell you is we just tell you that it's a better use of time, right? We tell you that we'd rather the supporters of the progressive movement spend their time on Twitter conversing with other people, discussing why it's harmful for you to say that you don't want to get Ebola in Africa, rather than them spend all of their time going through James Charles' last 10 years of tweets, trying to find marginal tweets that portray him as a pedophile. We tell you that that's a really bad use of time, but secondly, it also decreases the credibility that the progressive movement has, and that's overall why you actually get worse progressivism when you're actually just cancelling the person rather than cancelling the messages that are being sent. We'd rather you have really good discourse, spend your time discussing these issues, rather than just trying to find all the terrible, terrible things that happen to this person within their last 10 years of their life. Okay, second question, is the punishment of cancel culture proportional to what the individual actually does? Because importantly, we just tell you that the analogy of liberals believing in evidence to show that there's climate change as to why they're going to be proportional, that's just completely ridiculous, right? Because like they said in both their speeches, the progressive movement isn't a homogenous group, right? So even though like half of the group of people who are cancelling might be intersectional, might be proportionate, we tell you that the other half are probably just 12-year-old girls who are logging onto Twitter and want to engage with this new Twitter trend that is cancelling, right? We tell you that that's really harmful. Because what actually happens, and the impact that social media has, is twofold. The first thing that we tell you is that you want to be the first person who cancels the celebrity, because it means you're going to get the most attention. That means you're not actually going to fact check yourself because you need to do it really fast, and so you're just going to find any marginal tweets that in out of context will make them seem racist and use that to demonstrate why they're doing something really bad. But the second thing that we tell you is that you also want to have the most drastic, you want to have the most extreme tweets out there canceling the person, because you know that's what's going to get you the most retweets, and you feel affirmed by the fact that other people think what you're saying is really cool and interesting, which is why you're not actually going to get proportional and it's going to be really bad. And we can tell you that there are many, many examples of where this happened, right? We look at Gabby Hanna, who got cancelled for doing something like slightly marginal, where she had a video of an alleged rapist on her channel, but she didn't actually just get cancelled over the fact that she had this video, and instead people started cancelling her poetry, telling her that was really shit. People started cancelling her nose, telling her it was too big and she looks really ugly, and people started cancelling her to the point where she literally became suicidal. We tell you that at the point where you can literally become suicidal from something that you might have done 10 or 20 years ago when you were a 14-year-old and didn't understand what you're doing, that's when we know that it's definitely not proportional. And the last thing that we want to say is we also think that it's disproportional because usually you only really cancel the people that are minorities within the groups, right? We see in the James Charles example where he was cancelled for hitting on a married man. We tell you that a white woman who was doing the exact same thing at the exact same time wasn't cancelled because she wasn't part of the minority gay community. We think that's really harmful as well, and that's why we win today's debate.
Thanks, Government Whip. Now calling on Opposition Whip. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Thank you. Just 1 second. Let me just pull my timer up.
1 second as well. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay, go ahead. Proceed.
It's It's impossible to perfectly enforce certain laws and rules. It's impossible to know if every person we send to prison for murder actually was guilty of murder and whether that crime was truly perfectly proportionate. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have strongly enforced rules and norms. And when communities gather together to self-regulate certain types of behavior that are broadly deemed to be wrong, which in this case is the progressive movement, regulating a behavior that is in opposition to progressive values and commonly understood understandings of morality and, you know, the relationship between certain types of behavior and certain power dynamics, it is probably true that some instances will be disproportionate and some people will be harmed even when they maybe didn't intentionally harm, or maybe even if they were truly genuinely innocent. But what needs to be weighed in this debate is the effect that this has on people's behavior and people's beliefs. The way they self-regulate, the way the progressive movement itself becomes more progressive and tends to become more progressive over time, because we provide a strong social disincentive to say things that are racist or sexist, or could be interpreted as racist or sexist, and therefore forcing you to self-regulate your behavior, consider what you say, and make yourself overall more progressive and more in line with progressive values. That's the benefit here. The benefit is the Me Too movement. The benefit is like society, or the progressive movement initially, and then hopefully society more broadly, becoming more and more conscious of the ways in which certain types of behavior contravene progressive values. That's the benefit that we're achieving. Maybe some people, maybe you need to break a few eggs to make an omelet, but the omelet is still delicious at the end. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is examine the alternative that affirmative provide us, because as I will explain, that alternative is deeply deficient. The second thing I'll do is explain and kind of contrast it with the benefits of cancel culture in terms of changing people's behavior, creating safer spaces within progressive movements, and broadly just kind of shaping behavior in positive ways. The final thing I'll do is examine the shopping list of harms that they brought, compare them to the benefits of cancel culture, and ultimately propose that cancel culture is worth it. On to the alternative. By third affirmative, it becomes clear the opposite alternative for in this particular debate is just broadly a form of education, discussion, the message itself being discussed and sent. Here is the problem for that. That education and discussion is only possible in a context where refusal to discuss something that is potentially bad could invite further cancellation. Here is the problem for that side. The alternative to no cancel culture and no real risk of being excluded from progressive spaces or your career being damaged is for you to just not reply, to ignore claims that you've done something bad in the past. Typically, the overwhelming majority of instances of someone pre-Me Too or people trying to actually end sexual assault, the way it normally occurs with victims is that they speak out and no one listens, no one responds. So the harm here is that their education benefit only occurs in a context where someone is afraid, well, if I don't respond, if I don't apologize, if I don't be proactive and try and respond to this, I will be cancelled and I'll be cancelled greatly. That is the difference in incentives. And which is to say, if Me Too was just about discussing how bad sexual assault was and just people kind of vaguely apologizing, it would not be as effective. It had to end careers. It had to punish people in a visible way, which changed the incentives and behaviors for people within the progressive movement and adjacent to the progressive movement. The next thing I want to discuss, am I still capable of being heard? Just to clarify. Okay, the next thing I want to discuss is we tend to believe, the other response there is that we tend to believe high status people when they say they're sorry or they have learned. And if there's no genuine disincentive to prevent them, or if they're not genuinely afraid for their career, they're unlikely to change their behavior, the apology is unlikely to be genuine, and people are unlikely to actually learn anything from it. And that's the benefit of cancel culture. It links people's personal behavior and conduct, it calls them out, typically people who are higher status, culturally prominent, or adjacent to progressive movement, and they are shamed, excluded, it is explained to them how they're wrong, and they either eventually readmitted by performing certain acts of contrition, or they are permanently excluded. And we argue the progressive movement is better at distinguishing between who should be remitted and who is excluded, but even if it isn't, the change in behavior is the benefit that we want to achieve. Why is that? Well, firstly, the spaces we're talking about become safer because cancel culture is necessarily zero tolerance or close to zero tolerance for bad behavior. It tells victims that they can come forward and speak out, which encourages more people to speak forward. And it stops further oppression and abuse by removing an abuser or an oppressor from the space and hopefully removing their platform to conduct that to engage in that sort of behavior. That is a huge benefit, and it needs to be weighed against the opposition's claims that, oh, it may be occasionally disproportionate. Even if it is disproportionate, that is fine because it makes people more cautious. The second and far more powerful benefit, though, is a signaling effect, because it shows in public that certain types of behavior and anything that could be associated with certain types of behavior, like anything that could even be interpreted as vaguely racist, is potentially offensive, is potentially something that could reflect back on you. And because people are self-interested, they will self-police, they will self-reflect, etc. And that, plays into the fact that these are typically large media events, which say it sends a signal to an enormous number of people. It makes white people, cis people, men stop and think. The alternative is not people sitting down and listening and caring. The alternative is they're not thinking about their actions at all. And that is the harm that we address via cancel culture. Because of this status and the power that's involved here, because because abusers and oppressors so often get away with it and are able to use their status and the power to explain away their harms, we need a very strong response in order for them to eventually begin to wake up to the harm that they are creating. That's the benefit here. And notably, it occurs across many contexts. It occurs in small progressive groups. It occurs amongst friends who just are discussing things and vaguely adjacent to the progressive movement. It occurs in other countries other than the West or other than American college campuses, as Deepak explains, to no response. This is the kind of benefit we're talking about, and it's massive. So when you're weighing the harms that they bring, it needs to be weighed in contrast to the benefit we provide. What are their harms? The first thing they claim is there'll be a backlash. But as I've explained, the alternative to Chris Brown's fans defending him online is no one talking about the domestic abuse at all. And his fans they're reactive. They're reacting to the fact that people are criticizing him, and it is shameful that he did do those things. The second thing they claim is that there's a lack of evidence. That is directly contradictory with their argument about these movements or cancel culture being decentralized, because you can't centralize and decide that someone's done something wrong without anything happening at all. So there has to be at least some evidence that might prompt people to think there's something wrong. So there's always going to be evidence in that sense. The next thing that we hear is that it makes people dislike progressives. The first thing they say is it contradicts their own analysis, because they explain that this only occurs in progressive spaces. But also progressives have strong incentives to not let it hurt their reputation, to be reputationally sensitive, i.e. people will dislike Joe Biden, but they'll still vote for him. The next thing we hear is that it removes progressive commentators at the expense of conservative commentators. However, that is wrong. Their own echo chamber analysis suggests this. You won't get many people switching from James Charles to Alex Jones. Progressive stuff, people are still going to go and watch progressive things, they're still going to engage with progressive content. There'll be other progressive stars that launch forward. So there is no danger there. The next thing we hear is that cancel culture is not intersectional. Specifically, it's not intersectional along class and education lines. That is a critique of cancel culture on the basis of progressive values, and is itself an evidence of the fact that progressivism can self-correct and improve over time. So their own analysis is evidence of the exact thing that we're talking about. Also, there is a relatively small set of working class heroes who are torn down by progressive culture. It is far more likely for someone to be wealthy and famous. The next thing we hear is the final thing we hear is that it damages the ability for people to participate in activism by lowering the barrier to entry. But that's another word for saying it lowers the cost, which is incredibly good, because more people get involved, more people can learn about the progressive movement. The benefits to this are large, the harms are small, and ultimately we are willing to accept them in favor of a more just world, incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. Now calling on Opposition Reply. Hear, hear.
Two questions in this reply. How does this affect victims, and is this unfair for perpetrators? Firstly, on victims, because we provide a myriad of reasons as to why cancel culture has been hugely beneficial for victims and the people that have been oppressed by the language or the actions of people. Those included things like safety for situations such as when someone has committed an assault, but also things like emotional protection, like knowing society will not let the person who is upheld sexist or racist or other rhetoric that oppresses you in everyday life continue to get away with that unabated. But it also stops a platform for those people, and it provides deterrence for other individuals to go about that same behavior and empowers more victims to stand up. They had three main attacks to this to this material throughout their case. The first was that the alternative of education was sufficient. But we explained, one, that that was obviously not mutually exclusive. And in fact, you do get a lot of education through the discourse that cancel culture generates. But as we explain, often education is not sufficient, because if you need to remove someone from a platform because they are causing a risk to another person, then just educating them and hoping that they reform is not the answer. And also, a lot of people do have access to this information. It's just that they choose to ignore it. The second main attack they had is that this will generate backlash amongst fans. But we explained that that doesn't always happen. And if fans are as racist as they say, then maybe we should be trying to cancel the person that they look up to so much. And even if this backlash isn't perfect for victims, it is still better than the comparative, which is society continuing to let these people get away with their actions without any consequence. The last prong of attack they had was that this is not perfect, because sometimes it doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's not a critical mass. Sometimes there are worse people that you can't quite get, right? And that is all true. But at best, that is absolutely mitigatory and doesn't overcome the bulk of our analysis, which is that in many circumstances, you do achieve good outcomes and make the lives of victims safer. So I think we have won all of this material by a pretty compelling margin. And that is obviously the most important thing in this debate, given that these individuals are the ones that are most affected. They are the ones that are oppressed. But now let's look at, is this actually unfair? Because their case relies on an absurd characterization of this like ultra aggressive progressive movement, spending hours digging through the poor social media accounts of this uneducated 13-year-old that just didn't know that the N-word was something that they shouldn't say. Now their life is forever ruined. That is obviously an absurd, and you know what, if you buy that characterization, give them the win. But obviously, panel, I think you're smart enough to know that that characterization is absurd, not only through counter examples that we give you, but also structural reasons as to why that is unlikely, like the fact that the movement regards and holds in high stead evidence, like the fact that there is discourse that is generated from these discussions that inform whether someone should be cancelled, like the fact that the movement is capable of compassion and doesn't want someone losing their job and therefore having to starve because they cannot generate an income, like the fact that the progressive movement is intersectional and cares about whether someone is educated enough to know whether their language use is something that they should have been aware of. So people are able to react appropriately, but even if you still think this is unfair, again, they make no attempt to weigh any of that material to the wealth of benefits that we provide, and that is why we have won this debate.
Thank you, opposition reply. Now calling on government reply. Hear, hear.
One of the things that's consistently come up in their speeches is that cancel culture is good because it makes progressive spaces safer, because we shun all the people with problematic views and they no longer threaten us. But on this side of the house, we think that if someone holds deeply problematic views about consent or about race or about sexism, the appropriate response isn't just push them away from ourselves and say, well, the problem's out of sight, so it's out of mind, it doesn't matter anymore. The best approach is to change their mind. If we just send all the the people who, sexually harass women out of our space and say it's not our problem anymore, we haven't solved that problem. We've just exported it to someone else. Central to the idea of cancel culture is that you can't change, that you are cancelled, that you are over, that you can never come back, that your apology is fake. We think it's far better to give people a chance to change their views, to talk to them rather than attacking them, because when you threaten people, they stop listening, they become defensive, they don't change those views. That's why they stay problematic, they stay racist, and they remove themselves, they're still going to be racist and sexist when they disengage from the progressive movement. We're proud to stand by changing people's minds rather than shunning them and making progressive spaces safer at the cost of every other space in the world. Okay, 2 points emerged in today's debate. Firstly, whether it's fair and proportional, and secondly, where it's applied. Let's talk about whether it's fair and proportional first. What did Neg say? They told us that progressives have nuanced views, they're aware of intersectionality, so they're not going to make, not going to overreact. But it's not enough for them to say that people want to be nuanced and intersectional. They see themselves as being like perfectly rational and capable of weighing things up and being ultra fair, because we gave you a ton of mechanisms that push back on that alter people's like the way they see the world, that alter people's calculus in their mind. We told you that social media is designed explicitly to build echo chambers, that you get dopamine from getting retweets, and that encourages you to dogpile on without thinking. You can just press like a few buttons to send out a tweet, and it doesn't take a lot of thought to do that, and so you don't think too deeply before doing it. They needed to do more than just say, well, progressives are good people, so they'll only do good things, because we gave you lots of mechanisms to show you how we push them away from doing good things and from acting perfectly in every situation. But finally, we told you progressives aren't homogenous. Cancel culture isn't even homogenous. People hop on the bandwagon. There are teenagers who go on Twitter and just see the hashtags in the trending bar. There are drama YouTubers who drum up attacks based on their like external audiences. Even if 95% of the attacks are from really progressive people who are really nice in their attacks, that's still bad, because then you have like 5% of thousands of people telling someone to like kill themselves or calling them ugly or making deeply personal attacks. We think that's a huge harm when like the thing they're being punished for is making a problematic joke 10 years ago. That's simply not proportional. It's not fair on those people. It's also not fair. People recognize it's not fair. That's why it doesn't work in changing minds. Okay, where is it applied then? Firstly, in the cases where it's applied to like other progressives, we probably both agreed it works pretty well at canceling them, making them never come back. They told us that's good because we get better flag bearers. The problem is we probably don't get any better flag bearers, because there's not just like a critical mass of people who instantly transfer to like new YouTube stars, right? You just don't get other flag bearers. We told you kneecap progressives before they're able to start their careers. Weigh up in your mind all the good that James Charles has done in challenging gender stereotypes around dress and makeup, and now compare that to like making a problematic joke once in a video. It's simply not the same. We should still keep him for the massive good influence that he has. He doesn't have to be perfect in order to advance the world a little bit. Secondly, on the smaller scale, where people are shunned, we make progressive spaces better. As I said in my intro, we think if you attack someone, if they feel threatened, if they feel you're threatening your career, they're not going to listen to what you're saying. That means they get shunned, like they said. That means you push them out of those spaces. That's a problem because they're still really racist. They're still really sexist. We haven't decreased the net amount of sexism and racism in the world. If they like sexually assaulted someone, they're still going to do that again, but just now it's not on progressives. That's still clearly a massive harm. Incredibly proud to affirm.
Okay, thank you, debaters. Please